Very good morning, colleagues. Let's start our meeting. The 8,755th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. Before the adoption of the agenda, allow me to welcome Ambassador Philip Kirdelka, Permanent Representative of Belgium, for his first in-person meeting in the Security Council. On behalf of all the members of the Security Council, I would like to welcome you, Ambassador. The provisional agenda for this meeting is the situation in Somalia. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Somalia to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in the meeting. Mr. James Swan, Special Representative of the Secretary General and Head of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Somalia, and Mr. Francisco Caetano Jose Madeira, Special Representative of the Chairperson of the African Union Commission for Somalia and Head of the African Union Mission and Somalia. It is so decided. Mr. Madeira is joining via video teleconference from Mogadishu. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2020/798, the report of the Secretary General on the situation in Somalia. I now give the floor to Mr. James Swan.
Mr. President, members of the Council, thank you for this opportunity to brief on the situation in Somalia. You have received a detailed written update in the latest report of the Secretary General, so I will focus on just a few key points regarding elections, relations between the federal government and federal member states, the security situation, and humanitarian developments. Mr. President, this very week, top Somali leaders convened in Dhusamareeb in an effort to reach a compromise on how to proceed with the 2020-2021 elections. We commend those leaders who participated in this meeting, including President Mohamed Abdullahi Mohamed Farmajo and the presidents of the federal member states of Galmudug, Hirshabelle, and Southwest. Although much more work remains to be done, we are encouraged that their discussions are taking place in a conciliatory spirit, and they are examining a diverse range of electoral options. We regret, therefore, the absence of Puntland President Said Deni and Jubaland President Ahmed Islam Madobe from this important meeting. It is disappointing that they declined to participate despite repeated appeals from other Somali political leaders and international partners. We understand that there are strongly held divergent views among the leaders and that political tensions are high in this pre-electoral period. Yet it is precisely during such moments that it is most necessary for the nation's leaders to engage in dialogue and present their best ideas to find solutions in the interest of the Somali people. Mr. President, on June 27th, the chairperson of the National Independent Electoral Commission briefed the House of the People that at this late stage, one-person, one-vote elections could take place no earlier than March 2021, and then only if manual voting registration were used, or in August 2021 if the Commission used biometric registration. The chairperson's briefing underscored the dilemma facing Somalia's political leaders. Under the provisional federal constitution, Parliament must be elected through direct universal suffrage. But the Constitution also stipulates that parliamentary elections must be held according to a prescribed deadline every 4 years. This means that parliamentary elections are due by the end of November 2020. It is now clear that it is not possible to satisfy both of these constitutional requirements. As the Constitutional Court has never been formed, there is no credible judicial body to resolve this constitutional dilemma. A solution therefore requires broad-based political agreement. Unilateral action by any Somali stakeholder is unlikely to garner the support and legitimacy necessary for implementation. Mr. President, members of this Council have for more than a year urged dialogue and cooperation between the leaders of the federal government of Somalia and those of the federal member states. I'm pleased to report that since my last briefing to the Council, these leaders met virtually on June 22nd and then in person from July 18th to July 22nd in Dhusamareeb. These meetings became possible following a conciliatory initiative by President Farmajo to reach out to Jubaland President Ahmed Madobe. I commend both leaders for accepting this dialogue despite their significant remaining political differences. FGS and FMS leaders, federal government and federal member state leaders agreed in July in Dhusamareeb on the goal of timely and credible elections acceptable to all, and they authorized a technical committee to develop and present detailed options for consideration at their follow-up summit, which started on August 15th. The climate of cooperation in July, regrettably, was then somewhat undermined by subsequent political events, as some FMSs and political parties reacted negatively to the abrupt removal of the Prime Minister from office, among other developments. President Farmajo and 3 federal member state leaders returned on schedule to Dhusamareeb on August 15th, as agreed, to continue discussions. Again, we regret the absence of the others. It is, of course, up to Somali stakeholders to determine a model that will guide the electoral process. Nonetheless, we urge that such a model be arrived at through inclusive dialogue and compromise. It should be informed also by principles, including that it must preserve the tradition of peaceful rotation in office every 4 years, be practically implementable, ensure far broader representation than the 2016 model, be inclusive of women, and advance progress toward the goal of one person, one vote elections. Somalis and their international partners are watching closely the discussion currently underway in Dhusamareeb. It is incumbent on Somalia's leaders to rise to this moment in history and pursue agreement in the national interest. At the request of many Somali stakeholders, we have contributed ideas and options for a compromise electoral model, and international partners stand ready to offer support if requested by the participants. Turning to another important dialogue, we welcome the summit of the leaders of Somalia and Somaliland, convened by Djiboutian President Ismail Omar Guelleh on June 14th, with facilitation by the European Union and the United States. We urge that planned follow-up discussions by the technical committee and subcommittees proceed. Mr. President, we are now witnessing a worrying upsurge in al-Shabaab attacks, particularly in Mogadishu, but also in several regions. The vicious al-Shabaab attack on innocent civilians at the Elite Hotel on August 16th was one of an increasing number of recent attacks across Somalia, and is a tragic reminder of the continued imperative to improve security in Somalia. Long-term security, of course, includes many aspects, such as improved governance and justice systems, and inclusive economic development. Yet there unquestionably also remains a requirement for hard security capabilities and operations to counter al-Shabaab. In my May briefing to the Council, I commended the Somali National Army and AMISOM for their capture of Janale, Lower Shabelle region, in March. Since then, efforts have focused on stabilizing the recovered areas and consolidating presence in the area. I again salute the courage and commitment of Somali and African Union troops. 2021 is to be a critical transition year in which Somalia takes the lead on its security matters. Last week, the federal government of Somalia completed a concept note for updating the Somalia Transition Plan, and technical teams comprising Somali security leaders and international partners began work on the update this week. Force generation has faced some setbacks in meeting 2020 projections as a consequence of COVID-19. The comprehensive approach to security continues to operate at the technical level, but would be enhanced by additional strategic level guidance as called for by the Council in its Resolution 2520. Throughout this reporting period, despite the impact of COVID, the UN Support Office for Somalia, UNSOS, has continued to contribute reliably to the sustainment and operations of AMISOM forces and 10,900 Somali National Army troops. In preparation for key security-related decisions to be taken in 2021, we look forward to the independent assessment called for by the Council. Mr. President, Somalia continues to suffer chronic humanitarian crises with recurring destructive cycles of floods and drought, compounded this year by desert locusts and COVID-19. More than 5 million people, 1/3 of Somalia's population, still require life-saving humanitarian assistance. The 2020 humanitarian appeal of just over $1 billion is currently funded at only slightly more than 50%. We thank international donors and request their continued generosity in support of the Somali people. COVID-19 has, of course, undermined health, economic, and development gains in Somalia. Achievement in March of decision point under the heavily indebted Poor Countries Initiative was crucial to Somalia's ability to secure funding to mitigate the impact of COVID. We hope the new government and Prime Minister, once appointed, will continue and indeed accelerate Somalia's reform agenda for national development. Mr. President, while today's briefing has focused on immediate, pressing issues, we remained mindful that progress in Somalia requires a long-term commitment to governance, justice, respect for human rights, and inclusion of women, youth, and minorities to build the nation. In regard to efforts to counter sexual and gender-based violence, I note with concern the recent initiative by some parliamentarians to introduce a new bill titled the Law on Sexual Intercourse-Related Crimes. We have brought our concerns to the attention of the Speaker of the House of the People, and, at his request, we have provided him details of many troubling elements in the proposed draft. Among them, this draft bill would violate protections against child marriage and forced marriage, and it is not in conformity with international human rights commitments to which Somalia is a party. We urge that the previous 2018 Sexual Offenses Bill be reintroduced for consideration. Finally, Mr. President, on a positive note, I am pleased to report that the Secretary General has approved Somalia's request for renewed eligibility for the Peace Building Fund. The next period of programming will focus on the important topic of women, peace, and security. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Mr. Swan for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Francisco Caetano Jose Madeira. Mr. Madeira, you have the floor.
Mr. President, Excellencies, thank you very much for this opportunity to brief the Security Council on Somalia. I'm particularly pleased to do so again with my colleague, Ambassador James Swan. Our partnership is proof of the strong cooperation that exists between the African Union and the United Nations, which remains vital to our collective support to Somalia. Let me begin by recognizing that there have been significant developments in Somalia since I last briefed this Council in May. These developments are, in large part, due to the determination of Somalia's leaders to get together and consult on bold steps required to strengthen the country's capacity to fight al-Shabaab and other armed opposition groups, build the state of Somalia and strengthen its institutions, and stabilize the country through the provision of essential goods and services to the people. Mr. President, the emerging resumption of dialogue and collaboration between the leaders of the federal government and those of the federal member states is the most salient political development that has happened in the period under consideration. If harnessed and facilitated, this development can unlock the great potential of the Somali people to put in the second plan what divides them and build on the factors that bring them together and strengthen the unity and solidarity of their people. I commend the personal efforts of President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo and that of the presidents of the federal member states who, through emissaries, direct and indirect contacts, consultations, exchanges, and mutual reassurances, have laid the groundwork that made a reality this crucial development, the Dhusamareeb process. In Dhusamareeb, Mr. President, we've seen President Farmajo meeting bilaterally with President Madobe of Jubaland and discussing their issues. We witnessed President Farmajo exchanging views one-on-one with President Deni of Puntland, with President Ware of Irshabele, and with President Green of Southwest State. We've seen President Korkor preparing the ground and welcoming President Farmajo and all the other presidents to the big meeting. These meetings are important, Mr. President, and they are necessary too. And they should cease to be historical developments. They must be made to repeat themselves with such a frequency that they become normal events, regular encounters of leaders united in a common purpose of making their country a better place for all their people. We regret that for the meeting that started on the 15th of this month, two of these leaders are not there. We, international partners and friends of Somalia, have an important role to play to make this necessary presence and transformation a reality. The Dhusamareeb process deserves our unwavering support, as it represents a clear signal of the intent of Somali leaders to work towards a political consensus. This was the missing link, and now it seems to be close, and we should not miss this opportunity, Mr. President. The African Union, through AMISOM, is there in Dhusamareeb, supporting the Somali security forces in ensuring security for this ground encounter. While the parties will require more commitment and trust to ensure the Dhusamareeb talks are a success, the African Union will continue to not only secure the process, but also offer its political support where and when needed. Mr. President, the African Union welcomes the developing dialogue between President Farmajo and the Somaliland leader, Mr. Musa Bihi. The latest round of talks held in June, brokered by President Ismail Omar Guelleh of Djibouti, stands as the second this year. More importantly, this is evidence of Somalia's commitment to dialogue as a means of resolving its national differences. We are equally aware that the talks Joint Technical Committee is yet to meet again, and we underscore the importance of these talks continuing. Mr. President, the resumption of dialogue between the federal government and the federal member states has the real potential to act as a catalyst for achieving critical national priorities. I'm encouraged so far that the resumption of dialogue has already allowed for Somali stakeholders at all levels to engage in frank and inclusive discussions in search of a consensual approach to the issue of elections and its modalities. We, partners of Somalia, must strive to ensure that the discussions remain all-inclusive, because it is this inclusivity that lends legitimacy and will determine the consistency and implementability of the consensus that may be reached in the Dhusamareeb process. Following the National Independent Electoral Commission report to Parliament on 27 June, AMISOM, at the request of the National Independent Electoral Commission chairperson, has enhanced its discussions on election security, the securing of the NIEC's new premises, and the African Union Commission's technical support to NIEC prior to and during the elections. I am also pleased to report that AMISOM's police component that will play a critical role in election security is regularly engaging their Somali counterparts on areas of support. In this context, AMISOM police are currently training Somali police on the use of mapping tools for election security threat assessment. Despite this support, it remains essential as part of election preparation that the important work of the National Electoral Security Task Force resumes as soon as practically possible. Mr. President, I remain concerned at the threat of Al-Shabaab across Somalia, which is demonstrated by the extremist group's sustained attacks against government officials, businesses, civilians, security forces, and international personnel. The fight against Al-Shabaab will continue to require concerted effort. At the center of these efforts must be the enhanced collaboration, coordination, coherence, improved information sharing, and complementarity between the federal government and the federal member states, particularly on Somalia, as Somalia prepares to hold elections. More must be done to degrade Al-Shabaab's operational capacities. It is our assessment that as Somalia's national dialogue continues to edge towards political consensus, Al-Shabaab will seek to derail these efforts. Already, Al-Shabaab, in its public statements, has unsuccessfully attempted to undermine the Dhusamareeb process and foment national discord. In line with AMISOM's tasks, as stipulated in the African Union Peace and Security Council Communique 923 and Security Council Resolution 2520, I can report that despite the ongoing impact of COVID-19, AMISOM has continued to implement the transition plan. Since May, AMISOM, jointly with our partners in the Somali security forces, continued to conduct several targeted operations to disrupt, degrade, and deny Al-Shabaab freedom of movement and action. In addition to these operations, we have jointly secured and maintained key supply routes. As part of our transition tasks, we have also mentored various Somali security forces battalions through our ongoing collocation, particularly in Lower Shabelle. In Lower Shabelle, Mr. President, as this council is aware, recovered areas remain secure thanks to the continued joint operations and the bravery of our Somali security forces and AMISOM soldiers. The African Union, through AMISOM, has been the foundation of progress and security in Somalia since 2007. But with this, we have thankfully witnessed the capabilities of the Somali security institutions gradually increase. This increase must continue in earnest so that Somalia is eventually able to take the lead on its security responsibilities by 2021. To this effect, it is with satisfaction that we note that the work towards the revision of the transitional plan is ongoing, and the government has set a clear vision of what the revision should entail, the strategic priorities it should pursue, the actions that need to be done, to be implemented to make each strategic priority a reality, and the specific tasks that need to be fulfilled and by whom. Clearly, on improved and enhanced coordination and coherence, information sharing, and accountability, transparency, and complementarity will be necessary for the adopted revised transition plan to be fully and timely implemented. We are happy that this revision is taking place in tandem with efforts to revitalize the CAR's comprehensive approach to security mechanisms, which will be more aligned to the revised transition plan activities. A very positive feature in the current revision is that the elements of all-inclusiveness have been enhanced and the federal member states have been fully included and involved from the outset in the preparation of this new revised transition plan. They are participating directly and actively, and their views are being noted and reflected in the baseline documents that are being produced. Their seats are assured and reserved in the 3 technical committees tasked to produce the draft revised transition plan. This is of extreme importance, as no realistically sustainable peace operations in Somalia can succeed without the involvement of the concerned regions. As we begin to review the transition plan under the leadership of the federal government, it remains critical that a reviewed plan must focus on practical elements. These must include consensus on priority locations for transition and agreement on the realignment of tasks, particularly for international partners, as called for in the African Union Peace and Security Council Communiqué 923. Agreements on these elements will, in part, inform our collective assessment on what comprehensive support Somalia will require from key international partners in the lead to 2021 and post-2021, as called for in both the AU Peace and Security Council Communiqué 9223 and the Security Council Resolution 2520 of 2020. In terms of operations, Mr. President, one of the pressing issues that needs to be tackled head-on and addressed as a matter of urgency is the lack of commensurate Somali security forces to take over and hold areas under AMISOM control and those projected for liberation from Al-Shabaab. This is making it difficult for AMISOM forces in various sectors to reconfigure and create mobile forces for targeted offensive operations against Al-Shabaab, as they are forced by circumstances to keep holding and protecting the populations in the towns and habitational centers they have liberated from Al-Shabaab. Therefore, realistic and feasible approaches need to be identified, Mr. President, to effectively address the issue of the slow pace of generation of Somali National Army forces. As I conclude, I would like to draw the Council's attention to the African Union Peace and Security Council Communiqué 923, being broadly in line with paragraph 38 of Resolution 2520 of the UN Security Council on the need for comprehensive independent assessment in the spirit of the AU-UN shared visions for Somalia. The African Union continues to call for a joint AU-UN effort in delivering on this important assessment. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Madeira for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, Mr. President. And let me begin by thanking SRSG Swan for his briefing and welcoming Ambassador Madeira, and also thanking him for his comprehensive briefing, and Ambassador Osman. Mr. President, on behalf of the United Kingdom, I want to first express my condolences to the family and friends of those killed in the recent Al-Shabaab attack on the elite hotel in Mogadishu. I want also to reaffirm our solidarity with all Somalis in the face of such attacks. Deplorably, these attacks, despite COVID-19 and the Secretary-General's call for a ceasefire, continue to undermine peace and security in Somalia. We condemn these attacks, and we pay tribute to the ongoing commitment and sacrifices of AMISOM troop-contributing countries and the efforts of the Somalia security forces to counter Al-Shabaab. Mr. President, as we have heard today, Somalia is at a critical juncture on its journey towards a long-term political settlement and the peace, security, and stability that will enable. Somali leaders and international partners have committed to supporting and advancing democracy in Somalia. With the deadline for elections fast approaching, an agreement on a way forward is urgently needed. A timely and inclusive way forward is also critical. A way forward that respects the principles and commitments agreed to in the Mutual Accountability Framework, including at least a 30% quota for women parliamentarians. This agreement should represent clear progress from the 2016 election model, moving Somalia away from clan-based selection processes to direct elections, and enable as many citizens to vote as possible, as set out in the Provisional Federal Constitution. And so we welcome the ongoing consultations between leaders of the federal government and the federal member states at Dhusamareeb. We have always been clear that the electoral model will require broad-based support among all Somali stakeholders. To that end, we regret, as SRSG Swan and Ambassador Madeira both said, that President Deni of Puntland and also President Madobe of Jubaland have not yet joined the talks. We call for them to attend as a matter of urgency. It is vital that all stakeholders, the federal government, federal member states, Parliament, the Electoral Committee, and Joint Parliamentary Committee work together in a spirit of compromise to reach agreement and avoid unilateral or provocative acts that would undermine the hard-won stability in Somalia and the partnership with the international community. We stand ready to support agreed outcomes that strengthen inclusive politics and include a significant element of direct voting. Mr. President, turning to the human rights situation, we too share the concerns expressed by the UN and indeed the SRSG today about the Sexual Intercourse-Related Crimes Bill. It was encouraging to see so many Somalis speak out against it. We urge Parliament to give first reading to the original Sexual Offences Bill submitted by Cabinet. Any bill passed by the Somali Parliament must reflect its international obligations and commitments on the protection of children, women, and girls. Mr. President, I want also to express our deep concern about attacks on freedom of expression and against journalists and media workers in Somalia. Media freedom is a vital component of our democratic society, and the media has a vital role to play in Somalia. We call for journalists and media workers to be able to perform their work freely and safely. Mr. President, Somalia faces a protracted climate and conflict-induced humanitarian crisis. This crisis has been exacerbated by the global COVID-19 pandemic, floods, and locust infestation. We call on the international community to provide more funding for the humanitarian response and to step up efforts to build resilience and mitigate the long-term effects of climate change. The United Kingdom gave $420 million in the last financial year to Somalia and is now working to support the COVID-19 response. It is vital that the federal government and member states facilitate the delivery of relief aid to all those in need and ensure the safety of aid workers in line with international humanitarian law. I return finally to the security situation in Somalia. Somalia has made important progress in recent years, but the security situation, as we've heard, remains difficult. Next year's deadline for transition of greater responsibility to the Somalia security authorities presents both a challenge and an opportunity. Mr. President, it is vital that all those who have invested in supporting AMISOM and building Somalia's security forces now work together to agree to a future of international support on Somalian security. Without this, we risk wasting the progress and sacrifices made to date. The UN-led independent assessment on post-2021 security should offer the forum for these discussions, and I urge all partners to engage proactively with it. In conclusion, Mr. President, I want to emphasize 3 points. First, I want to reiterate our call, which the Security Council has made many times, for the federal government and all federal member states to come together and reach a decisive and inclusive agreement on elections soon. Secondly, I want to underline the importance of this Council, the United Nations, the AU, and wider international community continuing to support Somalia to achieve progress on political and security reform. And finally, I want to stress the importance of a united response supporting Somalia in its fight against COVID-19 and protracted humanitarian crises. Mr. President, Somalia, through the determination of its people and the support of the international community, has come a long way. We shouldn't lose sight of this. We stand ready to lend our support to navigate this next stage and to help Somalia realize its goal of peace and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement. I would now like to invite the distinguished permanent representative of Belgium.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will express myself in French.
Mr. President, distinguished colleagues, I wish to thank the Special Representative of the Secretary General, as well as the Special Representative of the Peace and Security Council of the African Union for their briefings and for their efforts. I wish to here reaffirm the full support of Belgium prior to addressing the political situation, human rights, and security issues. I wish to take this opportunity, through you, distinguished ambassador, I wish to extend my condolences to the families of the victims of the attack perpetrated last Sunday, targeting a hotel in Mogadishu. These acts of terrorism are unacceptable, and they are a further reflection of the fact that ownership of security by the government and the Somali armed forces is a priority. Turning to the political situation, I wish to welcome the resumption last July of high-level political dialogue between the federal government and the federal member states. This is a heartening development. It is of vital importance in order to tackle the urgent issues which Somalia will have to address. There's a need to maintain this dialogue and to see to it that the consensus between the federal government and all federal member states be arrived at. Belgium hopes that the removal of Prime Minister Hiare, under questionable circumstances, that this removal will not indicate a directional shift. There's an urgent need to adopt important decisions vis-a-vis the organization of elections, and these decisions must, as a matter of priority, be the fruit of compromise. They mustn't be or reflect a unilateral decision of an institution or Somali political actor. We encourage the authorities to broaden the democratic space in order to ensure the inclusion of a broader share of the population, including women, young people, and displaced persons, to ensure their inclusion in these processes, which are decisive for the country's future. In this context, Belgium would also like to voice its concern, as has just been mentioned by our UK colleague, our concern about the attacks targeting journalists in the exercise of their profession and exercise of their freedom of expression. Turning to human rights, sir, we remain troubled by the egregious violations targeting children. In my capacity as chair of the Working Group on Children in Armed Conflict, I am pleased to confirm that the group has just recently adopted conclusions on Somalia with the steadfast support of the Undersecretary General, Madam Gamba. The group welcomed in the conclusions, inter alia, the efforts undertaken by the federal government. Belgium encourages said government to persevere in its efforts to enact the necessary legislation to counter myriad violations, and this includes the bill on sexual violence. In that vein, we are troubled by the introduction into Parliament of a new text that appears to be incompatible with Somalia's international obligations. Sunday's attack is a reminder of the fact that the Shabab remains the foremost threat to Somalia's security and stability. Development and the deployment of the Somali army are vital in order to ward off this threat and to protect the populace. We eagerly await the revision of the transition plan. This will be the key document to guide Somalia, with assistance from partners, to guide Somalia towards a resumption of ownership for security and a reconfiguration of AMISOM. I wish to recall the support provided by the EU to Somalia via financing for AMISOM, the EUTM and EU CAP operations, as well as the anti-piracy at sea operation Atalanta. Support from the international community is not limited to security alone. Of course, there's also humanitarian assistance, which the people urgently need. The number of food insecure individuals amounts to millions. I would further mention institutional capacity building assistance. For the restoration of authority of the state is not merely a military operation. This is a matter of the importance of Somali authorities to provide the population with basic services and freedoms to which they aspire. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the permanent representative of Belgium. I would now like to give the floor to the distinguished representative of Dominican Republic.
Gracias, señor.
Thank you, Mr. President. We would like to thank Mr. James Swan and Mr. Francisco Madeira for their helpful and comprehensive briefings. Mr. President, the Dominican Republic welcomes the resumption of dialogue and collaboration between the federal government and leaders of the federal member states in July, as well as the agreement to set up a technical committee to make recommendations on modalities for upcoming elections. In this regard, we commend the United Nations and its international partners on their efforts to help build political consensus among federal and state leaders so as to continue to tackle Somalia's national priorities. One key to achieving this goal is approval of the Constitution as it has been reformed. For this reason, we urge the parties to continue to make the necessary efforts to lay the groundwork for resumption of constructive, inclusive, and transparent dialogue so as to achieve a political agreement that will make it possible to successfully conclude this review process. We also commend the presidents of Puntland and Galmudug on their joint meeting and pledged to cooperate on matters of peacekeeping, security, and economic development, especially in the region of Mudug. We also have words of praise for the President of Djibouti, Ismail Omar Guelleh, on his facilitation of the resumption of dialogue between Somalia and Somaliland. We're convinced that achieving consensus through dialogue among the political actors in Somalia will be the driving force behind the country's unification, and it will ensure that the upcoming elections are viable and are based on acceptable electoral modalities that is acceptable for everyone. Mr. President, we wish to express our concern at the security situation in Somalia, and we condemn the attacks perpetrated by the Al-Shabaab terrorist groups, some of which involve the use of improvised explosive devices. In particular, we condemn the attack perpetrated on the 16th of August against the Elite Hotel in Mogadishu, and here we wish to express our condolences to the relatives of the victims and our hopes that the perpetrators will be brought to justice. We also wish to recognize the efforts made by UNSOM and the UNDP to train and to raise awareness among Somalis regarding gender and the Women, Peace and Security agenda. Likewise, we welcome the fact that the State Assembly of Southwest set up a parliamentary committee on women, human rights, and humanitarian issues, and it has the potential to help push for legislation that will empower women and promote gender equality. We understand that greater participation of women in various areas of public and political life is vital. Women have the power to change communities. Their representation in the political system is key to achieving sustainable peace. By the same token, the participation of young people is necessary to help overcome the pressing challenges facing Somalia, and it's for this reason that we must ensure that we provide them with an environment that is conducive to their development. Mr. President, we also wish to express our concern at the very tenuous humanitarian situation in Somalia, owing to the triple threat posed by COVID-19, the locust plagues, and the floods that have affected thousands of displaced persons in recent months. In this connection, we wish to express our appreciation for the tireless efforts made by Somalia's humanitarian partners despite the difficult situation facing that country. And here we wish to encourage the international community to contribute to the Humanitarian Assistance Fund for Somalia so as we seek to save lives and meet the needs of the most vulnerable. In closing, sir, we wish to highlight the role being played by UNSAS, AMISOM, and UNSOM. We also are grateful to all actors who, through their initiatives, have been promoting peace and stability in Somalia. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished ambassador of Dominican Republic for his statement. I would now like to invite distinguished representative of the United States.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. and thank you, Special Representative Swan and Special Representative Madeira, for joining us today, and as well as for your comprehensive updates and briefings. I also wanted to join you, Massine, in welcoming our new Belgian colleague, Ambassador Goffin. It's really good to see you in person, although I know I saw you on the screen yesterday, but I wanted to welcome you officially. Mr. President, Somalia sits before a moment of profound opportunity. The country faces difficult circumstances and security challenges to get there. However, including in the attack on the hotel in Mogadishu last weekend, which the United States condemns. We express our condolences to the victims and their families. This and other attacks highlight the need for Somalia to keep the upcoming elections on track, which are fundamental to advancing stability and security in the country. Uncertainty and delays in holding elections will have the opposite effect. The challenges Somalia faces require concerted and unified efforts by its leaders. Unfortunately, the President and the lower house of Parliament's withdrawal of confidence in the former Prime Minister and his government in July has only heightened political tensions. We are concerned that such action has undermined the ongoing process of dialogue and negotiation between the federal government of Somalia, federal member states, and other key stakeholders. We strongly encourage Somalia's federal government and member states to hammer out a way forward for the upcoming elections. Elections need to be credible, timely, secure, practical, implementable, and built on broad-based consensus in a Somali-owned and a Somali-led process. We welcome the discussions underway in Dhusamareeb and encourage the parties to reach agreement on a model that meets the criteria that can be implemented by early 2021. The United States further encourages Somali authorities to maintain momentum on the reform efforts that brought about the reestablishment of ties with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund in March of this year. Reaching the HIPC decision point is an important milestone for Somalia as it lays the foundation for inclusive economic growth, but such reforms must continue as Somalia seeks to build long-term inclusive economic growth and resiliency. The United States is and will continue to be a close partner of Somalia. And Ambassador Osman, I meant to say earlier, it's very good to have you here in the Council with us. With more than $5.3 billion in bilateral foreign assistance over the last 20 years, we are working alongside the Somali people in support of improved food security, healthcare services, and water, sanitation, and hygiene. U.S. humanitarian assistance is helping Somalis overcome flooding, drought, locust infestation, and food insecurity affecting nearly half the population, with a quarter of the people also displaced by natural calamities and conflict. The United States is also working alongside our Somali partners to mitigate the impact of COVID-19. Since the crisis began, we have provided more than $23 million to support Somalia's COVID response, including for masks, hospital beds, testing center equipment, and communication efforts. Finally, Mr. President, as other colleagues have highlighted this morning already, al-Shabaab remains a destabilizing force in Somalia that has also repeatedly demonstrated the will and capability to launch attacks against neighboring states. We are encouraged that Somali and the AU mission to Somalia, AMISOM forces have made progress on the battlefield, and we commend their efforts, and that these military gains have been followed up with vital stabilization efforts to hold liberated territory. We do remain concerned, however, that the implementation of key elements of the Somali transition plan are behind schedule. We urge all parties to take the necessary steps to accelerate the transfer of security responsibilities to Somali military and civilian authorities. The United States remains steadfast in its commitments to promoting peace and stability in Somalia and to working with our international partners and assisting the country reach its goals for a peaceful and prosperous future. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for her statement. I would now like to invite the distinguished permanent representative of South Africa.
Mr. President, I would like to thank you for convening this important and timely meeting in the situation in Somalia. I have the distinct honor to deliver this statement on behalf of Niger, Tunisia, St. Vincent Grenadines, and South Africa, the A3+1. At the outset, the A3+1 would like to thank the Secretary General for his report on the situation in Somalia. We also would like to thank the Special Representative of Secretary General and Head of United Nations Assistant Mission Somalia, UNSOM, Mr. James Swan, and the Special Representative of the Chairperson of African Union Commission for Somalia and Head of the African Union Mission in Somalia, AMISOM, Mr. Francisco Madeira, for their briefings. We commend them for their efforts in Somalia. And also would like to welcome our colleague Ambassador of Somalia, Ambassador Osman, to our meeting today. We pay tribute to all Somalis who have perished since our last meeting on Somalia. The A3+1 statement will focus on 4 important issues and development in Somalia, namely 1, political developments, 2, elections preparations, 3, security, and 4, the humanitarian situation. Mr. Representative, the first one, on political development, the A3+1 welcome and commends the federal government of Somalia and federal member states for their recent meetings and consultations, which constitute an important first step towards building a political consensus necessary for the transition in Somalia. We agree the Secretary General's observations that the long-awaited resumption of dialogue between the federal government and federal member states leaders and the steps taken towards normalizing the federal government relations with Jubaland are critical for the restoration and of collaboration between federal and state levels of government. In this regard, the A3+1 further welcomed the meeting between President Farmajo and Somaliland President Muse Bihi in Djibouti, following the initial meeting in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. We appreciate the continued efforts of this regional, sub-regional, and international community in bringing political stability to Somalia and the Horn of Africa. This is a positive development towards consolidating peace, security, and development in the region. Niger, Tunisia, St. Vincent, Grenadines, and South Africa urge all stakeholders in Somalia to maintain this spirit of inclusive consultations and cooperation in all follow-up meetings in order to reach a broad-based agreement on critical matters. We regard this and other developments in the relations between the federal government and federal member states as a critical step towards building the essential political consensus on various important issues, including agreement on the electoral modalities, security arrangement, constitutional review, and power sharing. As a Security Council and international community, we should all support the recent discussion held by the federal and state leaders in Dhusamareeb. The international community and partners of Somalia leaders and stakeholders should also allow them to lead and determine their future without interference and imposition. Furthermore, we should appeal to Somali stakeholders to undertake urgent and concerted effort to reach a broad-based inclusive political agreement, including on the way forward on election and the finalization of the revised constitutions, among other key priorities. Mr. President, second, on the preparation of the elections, Niger, Tunisia, South Africa, and St. Vincent and Grenadines recalls its previous statement to this Council, in which we noted that the preparations and holding of one person, one vote elections in Somalia is a critical priority. We further underline the importance of dialogue, inclusive political participation, and resolution of political differences between the federal government of Somalia and the federal member states, which is critical to the success of these elections and national cohesion. We reiterate that these observations remain valid today. Therefore, the A3+1 commends the recent development related to the preparations for the elections in Somalia, in particular, the adoption by the House of the People, amendments to the political parties law, and the 4 resolutions that addresses representation in Parliament by all federal member states, including the allocation of seats to constituencies for both houses and a minimum of 24% representation of women in the Parliament. We are also pleased that the National Independent Election Commission continues its preparations towards the national elections. This is evidenced by the 2 possible options for conducting the elections, either in March or August 2021, depending on whether the elections are held through paper-based voter registration and polling or standard biometric voter registration. The A3+1 urges all the stakeholders in Somalia to engage constructively in an inclusive dialogue to reach a political consensus on modalities and timing of the elections. We then appeal to the international partners to coordinate their support to ensure inclusive, credible, and secure elections in Somalia. Mr. President, on the third security situation, the A3+1 remains concerned about the volatile situation in Somalia. We strongly condemn attacks by Al-Shabaab on Somalia civilians, security forces, AMISOM, the United Nations, and the international community. We pay tribute to the ultimate sacrifice of AMISOM and the Somali National Army in their quest to bring peace, stability, and development in Somalia. We reiterate our previous calls urging the federal government of Somalia, with the support of the UN, AMISOM, the international partners, to continue the generation, training, and resource of capable and effective Somali national forces that will ultimately take over the security responsibilities in line with the revised Somali Transitional Plan and the national security architecture. To this end, we again appeal for the international community and partners to mobilize the necessary resources, including the replacement of the trust fund for AMISOM and the trust fund to support the Somali security forces as they continue to make commendable progress to restore state security, authority, peace building, and state building. We commend, in particular, the efforts of Somali National Army in securing all recovered areas thus far. We, however, do recognize the challenges brought by the COVID-19 pandemic, as well as the rains from April to June that have impacted the expansion of some security activities, including liberating more zones. We are heartened by the number of reconciliation efforts by the state administration and communities aimed at ending the cycle of violence among the clans. We support peaceful resolution of tensions among the communities and peaceful coexistence between the clans. Mr. President, we strongly condemn the reported incident of civilian casualties, conflict-related sexual violence, particularly those affecting women and girls. We also strongly condemn grave violations against children in armed conflict, including the use, adoption, recruitment, killing, and maiming of children that have been registered during the period under review. We support the calls that all perpetrators of these crimes must be identified and held accountable. Furthermore, we have taken note of the development in the Parliament relating to the draft sexual offense bill and introduction of the alternative bill. Although we recognize the prerogative of the Somali Parliament to draft legislation, we call on the authorities to ensure that any new piece of legislation remain consistent with Somali international law obligations. Mr. President, the fourth humanitarian situation. Somalia has been impacted by the triple threat and shock of COVID-19 pandemic, infestation by desert locusts and floods. These challenges have deepened Somalia's humanitarian crisis. COVID-19 in particular have exacerbated pre-existing vulnerabilities, disrupted socio-economic gains, and affected livelihood of ordinary Somalis. We commend the action by the humanitarian partners and the expansion of their support to Somalia authorities to address the impact of COVID-19. The A3+1 notes that the adverse impact of flooding due to climate change remains widespread in Somalia during the period under review. We are concerned that this situation will continue to exacerbate the displacement of people, food insecurity, outbreak of waterborne diseases, as well as the adversely affected the livelihoods of those made most vulnerable across the country. In this respect, Somalia requires the continued support by the international community and humanitarian partners to mitigate the impact of the triple threat. We support the call by Secretary General for additional funding that is urgently needed to continue to deliver humanitarian assistance. We deplore that the security situation remains a major constraint to humanitarian operations. We are concerned and condemn the recorded incident against humanitarian operations and providers, including recorded incidents that led to the killing, abduction, and in some instances, detaining of humanitarian workers. Finally, Mr. President, Niger, Tunisia, Senegal, Canada, and South Africa commend the efforts and commitment of the United Nations through UNSOM and UNSOS, AMISOM, and UNMAS, the federal government, the federal member states of Somalia, and international partners for the continuous effort and progress to bring stabilization, deepen federalism, and state building in Somalia. We urge a continued and strengthened working relations between AMISOM and UNSOM to assist Somalia to take ownership of addressing its own security and challenges as envisaged by the transitional plan. We reiterate that the withdrawal of AMISOM from Somalia should be condition-based as the security situation remains volatile and is characterized by frequent terrorist attacks. In conclusion, Niger, Tunisia, Citizens Canadians, and South Africa support the continued presence of AMISOM and UNSOM in Somalia. In this regard, we support the renewal of the mandate of UNSOM for another 12 months when it ends on 31st of August 2020. We thank you, Mr. President.
I thank distinguished permanent representative of South Africa for his statement on behalf of A3+1. And I now give the floor to distinguished representative of Estonia.
Mr. President, we join others in offering our deepest condolences to the families of the victims of the recent attack on the Elite Hotel. We also join others in thanking the briefers for their insightful overviews. It is important that despite multiple challenges, including the COVID-19 pandemic, Somalia keeps moving ahead with the long-term goals of state building. We commend Somalia for the progress made thus far and encourage them to stay on course. Estonia warmly welcomes the resumption of dialogue between the federal government of Somalia and federal member states and strongly encourages all stakeholders to continue their talks to pursue national priorities, including the modalities of timely and peaceful elections. Given the high stakes of upcoming elections, it is crucial that no unilateral actions are taken and broad-based political agreements are reached. We hope that the stakeholders can agree on timely and inclusive elections, which represent progress beyond the 2016 model. We are concerned about the sexual intercourse-related crimes bill proposed by the Parliamentary Committee and urge the Parliament not to pass any legislation which is in violation of international standards. We also call on authorities to address the attacks on freedom of expression and investigate attacks on journalists and media workers accordingly. Lastly, we call the federal government to take steps towards establishing the National Human Rights Commission, which has a key role in promoting and protecting human rights. Estonia welcomes that the Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict has agreed its most recent conclusions on Somalia, and we are looking forward to their implementation. The security situation remains a major challenge. We condemn in the strongest terms the attacks by Al-Shabaab and offer condolences to the victims of the attacks. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic, all stakeholders must ensure that progress is also made on the security front. We further call on the federal government of Somalia to accelerate the updating of the transition plan. Clear timelines, clear tasks, and clear vision is crucial in order to achieve the end goal of Somalia taking full responsibility for its security. Finally, Estonia is deeply concerned about the current humanitarian situation, which has suffered the triple shock of COVID-19 pandemic, the locust infestation, as well as the floods. We are concerned that the humanitarian response plans remain underfunded, with 3.5 million people facing severe food insecurity for the remainder of the year. We call on the international community to address the funding gap. I would like to conclude by expressing Estonia's gratitude and support to the UN personnel in Somalia, AMISOM and Somali security forces for their efforts, commitment, and sacrifices to bring peace and stability to Somalia. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for her statement. I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Russian Federation.
Thank you, Mr. President. I wish to begin, if I may, by extending my heartfelt condolences to our Somali colleagues. In the wake of the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Al-Shabaab last weekend in Mogadishu, a hotel elite, my dear friends, do accept our heartfelt condolences, please. We are thankful to the Special Representative of the Secretary General, James Swan, as well as the Special Representative of the AU and Head of AMISOM, Mr. Madeira, for their comprehensive briefings on the situation in Somalia. We also welcome, during his first meeting in person of the new permanent representative of Belgium, Philippe Coudel. The Russian Federation welcomes the efforts of Mogadishu to achieve political stability, normalization of the socioeconomic situation, and the phased establishment of democratic institutions in the country. We steadfastly champion the maintenance of territorial integrity and unity of Somalia. In recent months, the federal government has managed to achieve tangible success in dialogue with the federal states. In the run-up to next year's scheduled elections, we trust that this week's summit in Galmudug will help to flesh out the modalities for the vote. The Security Council should fully support the obligation assumed by Mogadishu to conduct elections on the basis of the principle of one person, one vote. We believe that the broadest possible implementation of this model in Somalia potentially can help to extricate the country from the current political deadlock and the state of all-out war. This also can help to deal a major blow to the positions of the Al-Shabaab group, who are keen to maintain the traditional models for the vote. We value the now regular virtual consultations between the federal government and the leadership of the states of Jubaland, Galmudug, Puntland, Hirshabelle, and Southwest State. We are troubled by the interruption in August of the second round of talks between the delegations of Somalia and the self-proclaimed Somaliland. We urge both sides to explore the compromise of the solution for dispute resolution. We concur with the conclusions in the latest report of the Secretary General that the security situation in the country remains fraught. Al-Shabaab continues to carry out terrorist attacks. The fight against extremists is adversely affected by the shortage of weaponry equipment, in particular helicopters for AMISOM, and this is further compounded by the lack of engagement with the Somali National Army and the dearth of progress in the restoration of local administration and security structures in the areas freed of the terrorist presence. Of the extremist presence. We believe that our shared objective is as follows, to provide a response of the international community to the threat of improvised explosive devices, which are increasingly being used by members of Al-Shabaab in their operations. Under these circumstances, AMISOM remains the linchpin for counterterrorism. We supported the extension of the mandate of the African peacekeepers up until the end of February 2021. In the light of prospects of the phased closure of the mission, what is of particular importance is as follows: building the capacity of the Somali National Army. At the same time, we object to attempts by a host of countries to forcibly push through the drawdown of the mission. Given the current situation, we deem it judicious to continue full-fledged efforts at the Security Council to put forward concerted measures to provide comprehensive assistance to the authorities of the country with the aim of achieving a definitive end to the crisis within Somalia. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank a distinguished permanent representative of Russian Federation for his statement. I now give the floor to distinguished permanent representative of Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like to thank SRSG James Swan and Mr. Madeira for their informative briefing and for their work on the ground at this very challenging time. I warmly welcome Ambassador Osman, permanent representative of Somalia, to our meeting today. I join the others in extending our deep condolences to those lost their family members at the last Sunday attack in Mogadishu and other incidents happened in the country since our last met on Somalia. Mr. President, Somalia is now at the historical turning point, thanks to positive development in the dialogue and collaboration between the federal government and federal member states, improved security and economic conditions, and the preparation for upcoming election. The country is, however, still facing substantial insecurity and challenges resulting from the COVID-19 pandemic and weather-related crisis. On the matter under today's discussion, I would like to share the following point. First, about the election process. We welcome the communique of the meeting in July between the leaders of federal government of Somalia and the federal member state, which calls for timely and credible election acceptable to all Somali stakeholders. We also welcome the adoption of the amendment to the political party law by the House of the People. Nevertheless, the threats of attacks and impact of the COVID-19 pandemic have delayed preparation of the election and make them more difficult. We support the election process and the implementation plan set out by the government of Somalia and other stakeholders to ensure the participation in election for all the people and political parties. In this connection, we urge the federal government, federal member states, and political parties to make further effort to engage in inclusive dialogue to reach political consensus on the modality and timing of the election, including the political representation of people and minority. We call on the United Nations and the international community to increase technical assistance and measures needed to protect Somali citizens and political parties on the road ahead. Second, about national unity and reconciliation. We would like to stress the importance of national unity and reconciliation for Somalia on the way forward. Given the recent positive development, this is a precious time for the federal government of Somalia and federal member states, especially Somaliland states, to work together in mutual trust and for the benefit of Somalian people. In this connection, we support the effort by the government and the political leader of Somalia in maintaining a stable environment for dialogue. We therefore commend the recent consultative meeting between President Farmajo and Somaliland President Musbihi Adudi in Jubaland, and look forward to seeing their continued confidence-building efforts and specific follow-up action under the mediation of Djibouti and the facilitation of United States of America and the European Union. Third, about the fight against triple shocks. Somalia continues facing a number of long-standing threats and challenges. The triple shock of desert locusts, floods, and COVID-19 pandemic have caused severe consequences to economic and social gains, livelihoods, food security, and humanitarian footprint in the country. The impact of the desert locust and flood remain widespread and have affected at least 1.3 million people, with nearly 1 million displaced and in need of humanitarian assistance. The risk of exponential infection by COVID-19 also remain high across the country. Somalians need continued support to overcome these difficulties. We call on international partners to assist the federal government of Somalia in alleviating the socio-economic impacts caused by this triple threat. Fourth, about resilience for security. We condemn the attacks by Ansar against the Somalian civilian, local security forces, as well as United Nations and AMISOM personnel and facility. The suicide car bombing attack on the Elite Hotel in Mogadishu last Sunday killed 15 people and injured more than 20 others. In this connection, we call upon international partners to continue to support Somalia's security forces through training, equipment provision, capacity building. It is also incumbent upon international partners and relevant parties to uphold their responsibility to strengthen cooperation measures, to take all security measures needed against Al-Shabaab groups to protect civilians, especially women and children. To this end, we commend the unceasing works and untiring efforts of the United Nations Assistance Mission in Somalia and SOM. We reiterate our support for its mandate, and we are committed to work constructively with the United Nations, regional and international organizations, and relevant parties in promoting peace, stability, and development in Somalia. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank distinguished permanent representative of Vietnam for his statement. I now give the floor to representative of Germany.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you very much to James Swan and Francisco Madeira for their briefings. It's good that Ambassador Osman is with us today. I would like to make 5 remarks. The first one is on the electoral process. We would like to underscore that credible, free, fair, and direct elections in late 2020 are key to democratic state building in Somalia. The elections will be the yardstick by which the current Somali administration will be measured. We do acknowledge COVID-19 makes this much more difficult, yet the existing proposals on the table are, in our view, not sufficient. It has been made clear by other delegations, we subscribe to that, a return to previous forms of governance where a few groups decide for the whole country must be avoided. What we need to see now is concrete progress towards implementing the principle of one person, one vote wherever possible. My second remark is on the political cooperation between the federal government and the federal member states. This cooperation is key. We take note of some positive developments, including the July Leaders Summit. At the same time, we feel that more progress will be necessary. The speedy nomination of the new Prime Minister will be an important step to ensure an inclusive process. It is at the same time the basis for reaching sustainable progress, including the question of elections and the transition plan. My third remark is on human rights. We are, like others, deeply concerned about the sexual intercourse-related crimes bill proposed by the Parliamentary Committee. This is particularly concerning given that Somalia does unfortunately not have a good track record on sexual violence. Let me remind you, colleagues, that the United Nations Secretary General in his most recent reports on children and armed conflict in Somalia reported that Somali security forces and regional forces were responsible for 1 in 3 crimes involving sexual violence between 2016 and 2019. We therefore strongly urge Somalia to respect its international human rights obligations and return to an inclusive and non-discriminatory text. In this context, we would like to welcome the recent agreement in the Working Group on Children and Armed Conflict on the Somalia conclusions. These conclusions must now be implemented. My fourth remark is on security. The complex attack on the elite hotel this past weekend shows that the security situation remains a major challenge. We condemn attacks by Al-Shabaab on Somali civilians, security forces, AMISOM, and the UN and international community. And we extend our condolences to the victims and their families. We encourage all stakeholders to increase their efforts and speed up the work on the update and implementation of the security transition plan. In this respect, we are looking forward to the AMISOM independent assessment, which will contribute to the assessment of the abilities and gaps of the Somali security forces. This is no replacement for a stakeholder agreement, though, but it's still important. My last short remark is on climate and security. Dear Jim, we appreciate the work of the UNSOM mission on this field, and we support this in particular. Thank you very much.
I thank distinguished representative of Germany for his statement. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of China.
Mr. President, China thanks SISG James Swan and AU Special Representative Mr. Madeira for their briefings. It is now a critical stage for Somalia's peace and reconstruction. In the last 3 months, the Somali federal government has made earnest efforts to advance national reconstruction process and tackle the COVID-19 pandemic, and has gradually resumed dialogue with leaders of the federal member states. But at the same time, the country's security and humanitarian situations remain fragile, as evidenced by frequent terrorist and violent incidents. In this connection, I'd like to make the following 4 points. First, efforts to advance Somali political process must ensure that it is a process owned and led by Somalis. China encourages relevant Somali parties to further build mutual trust, gather momentum for dialogue, enhance federal institutions, and move ahead with constitutional review and other political reform processes. China supports regional and sub-regional organizations such as AU and IGAD in playing the role of mediators for the political settlement of the Somali issue. UNSOM has been actively coordinating the various efforts of the international community and has played a constructive role. China supports the renewal of its mandate for 12 months. Second, a critical task of the Somali political process is to hold successful elections. China welcomes the dialogue between the Somali federal government and the federal member states on specific electoral arrangements and encourages them to design electoral processes in light of the situations on the ground and people's wishes. The international community should respect the leading role of the Somali government and support full consultation among Somali parties to create favorable conditions for well-run elections. Third, eliminating the threat of terrorism is a prerequisite of long-term peace and stability of Somalia. China strongly condemns terrorist and violent incidents which often have innocent civilians among their victims. We commend AMISOM for its important role in maintaining stability. The ability of the Somali security forces to assume primary responsibility for maintaining national security is key to the timely completion of the Somali transition plan. The international community should assist Somalia in security capacity building and continue to provide necessary security support on the basis of a full assessment of local security situations. Fourth, the triple shock of COVID-19, flooding, and locust infestation have had grave impacts on Somalia's economic and social developments and worsened its humanitarian crisis. China welcomes the supplemental financing from the World Bank and IMF and calls upon the international community to step up efforts to help plug gaps in Somalia's humanitarian aid, enhance its capacity to respond to epidemics and disasters, and to support advancement of its national development plan. China has always been an active contributor to the Somali peace process and a long-time provider of humanitarian assistance and economic and social development support. This year alone, we have donated 2 batches of medical supplies to Somalia and will continue to help to the best of our abilities. China stands ready to work with the international community to play a constructive role for realizing the goal of peace, stability, and development in Somalia. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank distinguished representative of China for his statement. I now give the floor to distinguished representative of France.
Mr. President, I'd like to join you in congratulating and welcoming Ambassador Philippe Kudelka, and I wish him every success. And I would also like to associate myself with the condolences expressed to the Somali authorities. and to the relatives of the victims of the attacks that took place at the hotel in Mogadishu last weekend. Of course, we condemn this attack very strongly. I'd like to thank our briefers as well, and I would like to raise 3 points. My first point is on the political situation. France is of the view that Somalia is at a critical juncture. We've been closely following the talks underway between the federal government and the federal states. We note that these talks last month led to an agreement on holding elections on schedule, but without setting out in detail the modalities for the elections. For France, it's imperative that all Somali actors continue to work constructively toward preparing presidential and legislative elections that are inclusive, peaceful, free, and transparent, and that they benefit from UNSAM's support. If Somalia is to achieve stability, it is also essential that the elections be held as soon as possible in early 2021. We note with regret the removal of Prime Minister Hassan Ali Khairi by the Somali parliament in a vote that did not comply with institutional rules which we support. This decision is unfortunately not conducive to reconciliation in the country. My second point is on the security situation. France, here again, also believes that Somalia is at a critical juncture because Somalians should be the ones to shoulder responsibility for security in their country by 2021. In this connection, it's necessary that the transfer of responsibilities for security from AMISOM to the federal and regional security forces continue. We must also ensure that the Somali authorities update their transition plan by September 2020 to ensure it is fully operational by 2021. We call on the authorities to come up with a new force generation plan and to ensure that the regional forces are integrated in the national army. Thirdly, France calls on Somali authorities and their main partners, including the European Union, the United Nations, African Union, and AMISOM TCCs, as well as bilateral donors operating in the security sector, to step up their involvement in discussions on international support for Somalia post-2021 security sector. The European Union has demonstrated its commitment to active participation in these talks. France wishes to see a more transactional approach take shape to these talks. It's essential that the Somali authorities achieve the benchmark set up by the Security Council in Resolution 25/2020 in May. Decisions on international support for the security sector in Somalia post-2021 must be directly linked to progress made on these benchmarks. Lastly, France wishes to recall that current support model for Somalia cannot be taken for granted. All options must be on the table, including alternative options to AMISOM. In particular, we wish to recall that the current financing model for AMISOM by the European Union is not sustainable. If the European Union continues its support for the security sector in Somalia, it will be contingent on setting up an accountability mechanism and on the EU having a say in the strategic decisions of AMISOM and on the financial contribution of other partners. Mr. President, before I conclude, I wish to reiterate our concern at the humanitarian situation in Somalia, which has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. I also fully share the concerns that were expressed by the representatives of Belgium and Germany on sexual violence and on rapes of children. Protection of civilians and upholding their rights are key priorities that must be fully taken into account in the reform process in Somalia. We welcome the efforts of the United Nations in conjunction with other partners to adjust their action and to support the response of the Somali authorities. Thank you.
I thank distinguished representative of France for her statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Indonesia. I would like to thank SRSG Swan and AU Special Representative Madeira for their insightful briefings. I would also like to welcome Ambassador Abukar Dahir Osman, the permanent representative of Somalia, to this meeting. As the Secretary General has summed up, Somalia is at critical juncture. It is therefore crucial for all Somali stakeholders, supported by the international partners, to work together constructively. In this regard, I would like to highlight 3 points. First, we welcome the discussions between federal states leaders in Dhusamareeb last July. The Security Council has repeatedly highlighted the need for Somalia's federal and state leaders to come together in a spirit of unity and compromise. We would like to stress that only through dialogue can Somali stakeholders move forward with the reform agenda that it has committed to undertake. We are hopeful that a consensus on the electoral modalities can be reached that enjoys the support of all stakeholders, particularly the Somali population. It is also important to advance the implementation of national priorities and state-building efforts. Second, we remain concerned over the security situation. We once again condemn all recent attacks by Al-Shabaab, including the attack at the Elite Hotel in Mogadishu last Sunday, as well as the mortar attack targeting the UN compound. In this regard, let me join others in extending our condolences to the people of and government of Somalia, in particular families of the victims, and would like to ask the perpetrators to be brought to justice. We would like to reiterate that any attack upon UN personnel is unacceptable and that all perpetrators must be brought to justice. We are concerned that despite continued operation against Al-Shabaab and the COVID-19 pandemic, Al-Shabaab remains capable of conducting larger, more complex, high-profile attacks. It is thus important to continue to build the capacity of Somali National Army, SNA, and equip it with the necessary training, including in countering IEDs. We commend the continued operations by the SNA and AMISOM to recover areas under Al-Shabaab control, as well as to disrupt its capacity to conduct terror attacks. In our view, it is important to accelerate forced generation efforts to hold the recovered areas and pave the way for further stabilization activities. Third, Somalia is facing the triple challenge of COVID-19, flooding, and desert locust. Increased support from international partners are needed now more than ever, particularly in support of the humanitarian response plan. Sustained support is also necessary to alleviate the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic to ensure long-term recovery and resilience of the people of Somalia. We would also like to reiterate the importance of ensuring unimpeded humanitarian assistance and relief. I reaffirm Indonesia's respect for Somalia's sovereignty and territorial integrity and convey our utmost tribute to ANSOS, AMISOM, and all actors working to ensure lasting peace and stability in Somalia. What happens in the next few months will determine the future of Somalia. We hope that all Somali stakeholders remain committed in their pursuit of dialogue and reconciliation to ensure peace and prosperity in the country. I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the distinguished permanent representative of Somalia.
Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to begin to commend the permanent representative of Republic of Indonesia and the permanent mission of Indonesia for their leadership as the President of the Council for this month of August of 2020. I will also want to welcome Ambassador Philippe of the Belgium to the New York and to the Security Council and to be a member of the family of the UN. It's an honor to address you in this gathering of Somalia's partners at the United Nations Security Council. I want to reiterate that Somalia's government is strongly committed to its ambitious peace and state-building agenda. And we are making very clear strides toward achieving inclusive politics, strengthening democracy, and constructing the very rights-based national institutions that are pillars of strong societies. I'm happy to report that we have held successful regional elections in sub-federal member states in the build-up of the planned one-person, one-vote national parliamentary election, and we are determined to facilitate the success of this process through the recently passed electoral bill of the legislatures. Mr. President, the challenge of Somalia has been the monopolization of the legitimate power by few at the expense of the Somali people. Our government, led by His Excellency Mohammed Abdullahi Farmajo, is determined to bring the people of Somalia to the center of their democracy by giving them their historic opportunity to vote on their future path. This is a noble endeavor which will strengthen the civic engagement, public trust in policy, while firmly instilling accountability within the Somali policy. Mr. President, today President Mohammed Abdullahi Farmajo is sitting in Dhusamareeb, a city in the central Somalia, with key leaders of federal member states to discuss modalities and strategies for making the ambitious of universal suffrage of the genuine possibility. The President also addressed the House of the People immediately before the Dhusamareeb meeting and promised to respect their constitutional mandate to legislate for the Somali people by bringing all electoral decisions back to them to deliberate and vote to move forward from Dhusamareeb meeting. For democracy and stability to thrive in Somalia, it's a must that we must respect the key roles of the Parliament, the Upper House, and other mandatory electoral bodies, most specifically the National Independent Election Commission, and the Intergovernmental Committee established to address the outcome of the Dhusamareeb process. Accordingly, we are determined to move Somalia away from exclusive and exclusionary processes that determine our politics and shackle our people to voicelessness, especially our youth, our women, and our minorities. Of course, in Somalia, we understand that the need for negotiations and consensus building to achieve our democratic goals, and through the federal government's commitment to the Dhusamareeb process, we have proven this. A stable, democratic, and prosperous Somalia is in the interest of each and every Somali, and the achievement of this will be the best way to celebrate our joint effort with our valuable international partners in delivering a better tomorrow for Somalia and the world. However, Mr. President and Excellencies, I'm very sad that there are those who seek to derail the democratic processes that our government investigates for Somalia with a narrow focus on all broken exclusive politics. Our government will continue the engagement with all stakeholders openly and fairly, but will not and cannot tolerate spoilers at this critical time in Somalia's history. The international community should continue to support and encourage the government programs of inclusive politics and democratization, and it must not give the unjust pressures of the spoilers. Mr. President, security has been our government's focus and the greatest public expenditure since taking office, because achieving other endeavors, including poverty eradication, quality education, climate action, and inclusion, depends on security. Today, we are building a well-trained armed forces, rights-based security, and accountable security institutions to take over the responsibility of securing Somalia. Our government, in partnership with AMISOM and other key international supporters, is working hard to achieve this through the transition plan in line with the national security architecture. These comprehensive reforms are not easy, but thanks to the commitment and absolute determination of the federal government of Somalia and its partners, I'm convinced Somalia's successful security sector reforms will provide us with the best possible security apparatuses to safeguard the well-being and the progress of the Somali people. Mr. President, the government of Somalia is working hard with its people to build a more sustainable future free from poverty with strong social protections. Our approach to eradicating poverty is to create economic opportunities to our people, especially the youth. And to do this, We are engaged in an ambitious and successful fiscal and economic reform program guided by International Monetary Fund, a staff monetary program. We are proud that throughout the reform focuses benchmarks, we managed to achieve debt relief in the first quarter of this year, and we are working to further strengthen our economy to make it work for all our people. A key benefit of debt relief has been renewed confidence in Somalia's ability to change and the access to grant resources which have been proven valuable through the COVID-19 pandemics. In conclusion, Mr. President, the Somali federal government is absolutely committed to the socio-economic, political reforms, and to improve the lives of the Somali people. It's our mandate and duty to do the heavy lifting to deliver stability, inclusive politics, and opportunities for our people by working closely with our international partners. This is a commitment that we will continue and deliver on, God permit. I thank you all, and thanks for your partnership and friendship.
I thank a distinguished permanent representative of Somalia for his statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I will now adjourn the meeting so that the Council can continue its discussion on the subject in closed consultations. I would kindly ask all observers to promptly exit the chamber directly upon the adjournment of this meeting. The meeting is adjourned.